Okay, so I'm now with Jay Martin, and this is the first bit that we've done about the horrific incident that we've been watching over the last few days. That started in the middle of last week. We're talking about this Grenfell Tower fire, in which the building went up within 15 minutes, and most likely we're talking over 100 people would have died, but they haven't released final figures. But in particular, what we're seeing is that it was a block of flats that was built in 1974, and it was renovated in 2016 after years of complaints and frustrations about issues within the building. That you can read, you can go and read the Grenfell Action Group's blog and just read about all the various things. And that one of the main concerns when they actually did a refurbishment of this block in West London in 2016 was to make it look more presentable to the outside world, and this borough that it's in, Kensington and Chelsea, and this area that it's in is an area of steep divisions in terms of wealth. It is an area within London. London's already chronic in terms of the division. It's an area within London where properties go for over £1 million, and there's such a sharp contrast, the sharpest contrast, in fact, of wealth division in the entire city. And so now what they did with this cladding that we know is what was responsible for the building going up within 15 minutes is to make it look more presentable to the outside, and they didn't do very much about the inside. So what are the sort of thoughts that you've been having, Jay, about this Grenfell Tower block situation?
Well, the first thing to say is, I think thoughts, feelings, go out to not just the victims of Grenfell, but the victims of the broader austerity and cuts that this country has seen. We've seen blood on the hands of this zombie government. I think the one thing that we need to just pause and reflect on is, this is a horrendous situation. It's truly unimaginable in modern society that what's happened has happened. I suppose my thoughts have been immediate on what I've been doing this week. So I'll just put it into a context. So as a trade union tutor, lecturer, we deal with everything from workplace rights, economics, politics, and for this week it was health and safety. Now, whenever you're teaching, you'll have a lesson plan, a day plan as to what it is that you're going to teach. And it just so happened on Wednesday, my morning was on fire safety. And it was pretty difficult in the morning, on Wednesday morning, deciding whether or not to continue with fire safety, given the horrendous images that I'd seen in that morning. So ultimately, I decided to continue, and it's on that basis that I've built my context as to what's happened. The first thing to say is I don't think there's a city in the country that has not seen tower blocks built in the 70s when governments were building homes for people of both political persuasions, that in all cities we've seen, essentially a lick of paint, in this case panelling, put on, not for any real safety consideration, but outwardly to make the place look a little bit more presentable. So, for example, in Salford, where you've got what used to be the two famous red towers, they've now again had a lick of paint, and it looks from the outside more presentable. But within the context, of my trade union background, when I'm looking at what's happened. This, and I hate to say this, hasn't come as any surprise. Back in the coalition days in 2012, we saw one of the, from 2010, sorry, we saw one of the most poisonous ideas of the Condems in what's known as the Red Tape Challenge.
Yes.
And the Red Tape Challenge was essentially a forum for businesses and, in theory, citizens to go and put their suggestions up upon this forum and suggest cuts to red tape. Now, again, in theory, you could suggest additional protections, but if any of your listeners want to go and have a look at the archived sites, Google search Red Tape Challenge, and you'll be able to see just some of the horrendous ideas in cuts of red tape. Now, with the suggestions from the Red Tape Challenge, then sprouted the truly Frankenstein monster of legislation known as the Enterprise and Regulatory Reform Act. So that act doesn't necessarily affect social housing or anything like this, but what it does do is just give you a flavour as to what it is that the government was up to. So when they passed this act, which saw savage cuts to rights within workplaces, cuts to workplace safety legislation, for example, RIDDOR, where reporting mechanisms extended from 3 to 7 days, and I'll try not to spoil you on RIDDOR. But what you see is, health and safety. David Cameron at the time is an albatross around the neck of the UK, was one of the quotes. And further to that, you then see another ridiculous idea, which is for every one law that's brought in, 3 must be cut. So what we've got is workplaces that are inherently unsafe. We have employers who, whilst they might be aware of regulations and legislation around health and safety, frequently ignore it. And to give you context, just with Grenfell, was from about 3 weeks ago, I was alerted to a fire in a Wetherspoons where I live. So I'll not give the exact location, but a fire in the kitchen. Now, ignoring the fact that there were rats all over the show, the fire was a blaze from oil, cooking oil. And the only fire extinguisher that was available was a water, H2O. Now, everyone who's listening to this will suddenly go, well, hold on a second. Everyone knows about not putting water, with oil fires. That's one of the first things you're taught in fire safety when you're in school. But that's the situation with employers. And employers often take the lead from the government. So when the government are cutting back on legislation and rights, employers then, to shore up profit, then do exactly the same. So my thoughts initially, Grenfell, you have an employment situation that's horrendous. And then you look at the social side, which is just as bad, if not worse, where no longer, and again from 2013, no longer is it a requirement for houses to be, quote, safe for human habitation.
This is the big controversy, isn't it? Because these regulations are favouring big, employers, business, big companies. It's going to be easier to run your business because you don't have all this red tape. And then we have this thing as well with this proposed housing legislation that would only make it a requirement that where people live, rented property will be fit for human habitation. It seems like a sort of basic demand that would take us, that if it's not met, would take us back to the times of Charles Dickens. So we can't even have a place that is fit for human habitation. You'll just have what we give you. So this is the context after 2010 that led to this culture that ultimately led to the situation of Grenfell, of what happened in Grenfell Tower.
But indeed, it's profit above safety, and this is what happens when so much of the public sector, so much of our council houses, our stock, and I say our, when Thatcher starts selling off council houses to private landlords or individuals, what right did she have to do that? That was under the ownership of the country. And as such, when the country has a vested interest in the tenants and the people who live within public houses, within council houses, then you have legislation that fits. As soon as it goes into the private sector, then it's around about and I'm not referring to individual homeowners. I'm referring to huge landowners, landlords. 70 of which are in the Tory party at least, and you then have vested interest, profit at all costs. You've got a triple whammy in terms of, so whilst I'll talk about the fire itself in a few minutes, I just want to really set the scene as to London, as in Manchester, beginning in Liverpool, as in Leeds, beginning in Sheffield. We are seeing, you talk about the gentrification of entire cities, where in a 1984 Orwellian nightmare suddenly becoming true, you have inner cities. Let me ask the question. Does anyone think that people living in the Shard or, I don't know, within any of the big tower blocks in the city, the residential tower blocks, does anyone think that the fire standards, the fire safety, the health and safety of people living there would ever be impacted by a fire like at Grenfell?
So we're probably thinking that not. We can give an example of something that was in London. The Johnny Void writes a blog there. I'm sure he's going to be very angry about this, amongst with everybody else. And in terms of fire safety and exits, in one building there was a protest because they had to allocate a certain proportion of it to social housing, and they told and they gave the social housing access to the social housing by a separate door at the back, and then the posher, more grander, more exclusive apartments had their own entrance. So that would mean that they had a different exit from the building as well that was smaller and poorer. So that's an example of true segregation between a class divide there in London, and that caused protests outside.
Well, do we think that the Barbican Tower, for example, do we think that would have substandard regulation, or just meeting the regulations? It's not just the gentrification where the people who live on the outskirts, are getting pushed out, the poor, away from cities. Just on this, I was living in the city centre of Manchester in Castlefield, where my rent was £600 a month. That doubles to nearly £1,200 when the BBC move up. And suddenly, people are gentrified out. So a lot of my friends, I suppose if you were to track on a map, lived pretty central in Manchester, now live mostly in Salford, and are now out of the city centre because they can't afford it. And that's just one part of this. We have a tale of two cities, to quote Dickens. Where we have the affluent, and if any of you listeners have read Orwell, where we have, the rich living within the city zones, and the poor, well, you just get whatever. And this is a wealth issue. This is, this isn't just a relaxing of health and safety standards. This is an issue that a lot of people, I imagine, will be having sleepless nights around. We live in similar situations. Could this happen here? And unfortunately, the answer is yes. So the first part is that of gentrification, that of, these things tend not to happen to those who have the most money, and that isn't fair. It's not just fair, it's criminal. And I think that on that basis, there will be criminal proceedings against those who should have looked after the people in Grenfell. You've got, and I'll come on to it in a second, but the second part of this is that of the standard of housing. There has been a collapse in council housing, new builds, since Thatcher, really, and I include the Labour government from '97 in this as well, where it's essentially tokenistic council housing stock, which is often given to private tenants, often in housing associations, and this is a huge issue. If there is a tragedy like this, the survivors of Grenfell are rehoused not in the borough, not within the area in which they live, because the council doesn't have the stock to house people. You've got homeless, you've got people who are needing emergency assistance, in dire situations, who instead of being housed within the area in which they live, which is what should happen, they're often housed within B&Bs, within hotels. I have to say, I hear stories like Donald Trump, but I'm told of stories, through what I do for a living, from community members, from the unemployed, who, one of which is, I was trying to send a certificate for a qualification, but my address is in a hotel, because I've been living there for 6 months because the council doesn't have anywhere for me to stay. This is the situation that we're in. There's been, since Thatcher, it's been about short-termism. It's been about profit at all cost. It's not been about what does a decent society look like. If we talk about the race to the bottom, this is it. So if my first point is gentrification, my second point is this of the race to the bottom. Why does it take horrendous acts for people and government and commentators and all of this to react? Why does the stable door have to be bolted before we actually do anything? So we've got a reactionary society where, the country, has suffered from, 3 terrorist attacks, in the past 3 months. We've now got a fire tragedy which was so preventable if it wasn't for cuts in legislation and cuts to the fire service, who, are saying that, when Boris Johnson, various other Tory party grandees are saying that, well done to the fire brigade, and all of this. Well, the real picture is, fire crews, what fire crews? You've got 2 or 3 people driving a fire engine instead of a full team with equipment that can't put out fires above the 10th floor of any building because, again, there's no investment, cuts. And I wonder just how far the cuts have to. We look at the frothing at the mouth of the Daily Mail readers who are saying, we send the army in. Well, the Green Goddess tanks don't have any, don't have the power to put out anything above an 8th floor. So the country is in a mess because of cuts. Gentrification, you've got race to the bottom and reactionary. And the third bit is that of legislation. Just before we get onto this, just some interesting comments. Again, just thinking about Theresa May, Jeremy Corbyn, and the Queen. See, Jeremy Corbyn, hasn't made, the song and dance of turning up or not turning up, unlike May. Corbyn's been there, he's embraced, he's been there for people, he represents Islington, not too far away. This is another tragedy, within, a family of Labour MPs. You really need to look at the interview from David Lammy. Theresa May turns up, but again, she other than the fact that I believe that she's got socio and psychopathic tendencies, even if that's it's the only other explanation for her response to the public is basically, you're beneath me. She gets bungled into a car. She doesn't speak to anyone. To be under no illusion, this is the death of May. We have in this country a Katrina. This is our Hurricane Katrina.
Well, that's
where the government response.
Well, of course, she's also worried about the reaction she will get because Jeremy Corbyn, is embraced because of the way that he's sympathetic. He's hugging people, he's offering sympathy and support, and she's just turning up with an entourage meeting only the officials. But she'd be worried about the reaction she's going to get because of people have at least a subconscious awareness that the change in these regulations, the cuts, have all led into this sort of outcome. And she's the face of that.
I'm going to come on to the regulation because regulations, as we know, are essentially party political, which is why I'm just mentioning Theresa May now. But I just want to make an observation on the Queen as well. Whilst I'm sure a lot of people were quite happy that she turned up, unlike Theresa May, Theresa May promised the livers of Grenfell that the situation, the housing situation, would be sorted in 3 weeks. Now, what kind of response is that? 3 weeks of homelessness? What does this mean? Now, there's fellow trade unionists that I was speaking to last night across London, some of which were involved within the march, receiving vile criticism from the usual trolls on Twitter. This is, we don't mind the victims marching, but how dare trade unions? Well, trade unions are there to assist all in or out of work, as is, most humanity, I would like to think. But just an observation on the Queen. Well, I'm really glad that she turned up, and maybe this is just a bit of anger coming out, but if there's anyone who has enough spare rooms that aren't being occupied in Buckingham Palace or Windsor or wherever else it is, it's the Queen.
770 in Buckingham Palace.
I'll declare, yes, I'm. Well, yeah, exactly. And whilst I'll declare, yes, I'm a Republican, so I'm going to be critical. What a difference that would have made her to have done something like that.
Well, yes, but you're comparing
so again,
sorry to cut across again. I was just to go back to what you're saying about it's a Hurricane Katrina moment for Theresa May. And this is referring to a picture of George W. Bush in a private plane, it must be like Air Force One or something, looking down over the city of New Orleans and not actually descending into it to offer support and so. What's happening with Theresa May now and just going around in this private entourage like some sort of rapper almost, but not actually meeting anybody other than the officials, fire service and police who's involved, unlike Corbyn, is said to be comparable, and it could even be part of the chain of events. The government's in a pretty weak position at the moment with this minority situation. The negotiations with the DUP are probably not going very well at the moment. Have been put on hold because of this huge incident, and now this is said to be something that could tip her over the edge. Do you really think it could?
I do. I don't see how. I mean, she will cling on for power as long as she can do, but don't make any mistake, this will be the end of it. But it's not her that we need the end of, it's the Tory government. Just before we get on to the legislation side of things, it's very interesting looking at the analogy of George Bush looking down. You see, because there was Theresa May looking up before being bungled away. So it's a very interesting analogy, this. This is a Katrina moment. Not only is it a Katrina moment, not just, whilst Katrina was, partially unique given the of this, but there was a feeling for a number of people that this could happen to us. There'll be people, as I've just said, in flats, in council stock, even in their own homes, that will be thinking this could happen to us.
Because it follows years and years. I'll let you carry on this first, but I was going to go about the exact reasons why it could, based on the concerns of the Grenfell Action group, and the fact that it takes something as huge as that to for those concerns to be actually realised in the end, it's just years and years of fobbing off that people in social housing situations have over getting things fixed, over getting a decent standard of repair to the building. And it takes something catastrophic, as the Grenfell Action Group themselves pointed out, before in this culture that favours the landlords, that favours companies, favours of cuts, before they say, actually, no, this is now where we need to do something, not then. But anyway, just can't. But for now, just continue with what you were saying.
I think it would be good to break it down. But before we do that, when in 2012, well, from 2010 onwards, unions, and specifically thinking of hazard centres, such as the one in the Greater Manchester area run by Hilda Palmer, trade unionists, Labour MPs, health and safety groups were explaining that, well, there's several issues here. HSE, that are planned to the HSE, who inspect and enforce, along with other enforcement agencies, safety in workplaces. Cuts that mean, the HSE can't inspect workplaces dozens of years to get around every workplace. I think last figure was something absurd, like 1,048 years for the HSE to inspect every workplace, thanks to savage cuts, 34% cuts to the HSE, and more to come. Well, we were saying this when in 2012-13, this human habitation clause was removed. That this is making it's not just workplaces. And obviously, as a trade unionist, this is where why I'm discussing that. But it's the it was the social side of it. How can you have housing not fit for human habitation? And then cuts to particular areas of fire regulation. Where, for example, with this cladding, it was meant to be the case that, yes, it was to insulate and, should protect from fire, external fire. But the regulations didn't. We cut back to, well, if there's a fire internally, well, this cladding isn't there for protection. Well, of course it could be, but that means, you've then got two types of cladding. You've got one that I think it was £5,000 more expensive to put on versus the one that was, which was essentially a rip-off, a rip-off panelling, which then led to the fire. So again, it's cuts and it's on the cheap Britain.
Nominally more, that's all it was.
Rollback in regulation.
Just nominally more, wasn't it? When you're spending that yeah.
Here's the difficult bit. When I do a lot of work with civil aviation, but just to give you an example of this. So the first thing that happens is you end up with, it's health and safety gone mad. So the likes of the Daily Mail, the right-wing press, that are constantly driving, guided and enabled the coalition government, the Tories, when they won in health and safety, because people, on the street, it's health and safety gone mad. Well, no, the health and safety doesn't go mad. Health and safety protects. Sorry, it's an inconvenience, especially to private landlords, but it's there to protect, So, no, it's not health and safety gone mad at all. But that enables cuts. And you have a public disinterest in health and safety legislation. We have, and I'm not referring to, left groups or anything like that, but broadly, if I speak to people on the street and say, what do you reckon to, fire regulations? What do you reckon to RIDDOR? There'll be shrugged shoulders, and I'm not really interested in that. In other words, it's not an election issue.
Yeah, except for now, when it's in people's minds.
Well, I think it will be now, but again, why does it have to take, when in 2013, we, other tutors, my union, Unite, are explaining that, this is going to kill. Cutbacks to safety legislation in terms of housing is going to kill. Cutbacks in terms of legislation regarding to workplace safety, and the fact that most employers just disregard it. Think of safety reps as a pariah instead of the people who save lives, and even from their perspective, save them money. We're saying this, and it was dismissed as typical left overreaction. We don't know what we're talking about, ridiculous, and all this. So again, it takes horrendous tragedies for things to change, and I wish that wasn't the case. I really do. But again, as I said, I do a lot of work with civil aviation. So if you want an example of public disinterest, how many people actually listen to the safety demonstration, on planes if they're travelling? Next to no one. If I'm travelling to see friends, family in the south of France, which I do as often as I can, even I, end up with this, sort of disinterest. So it's the usual stuff. And yet, when it comes to emergency situations, when it comes to all this, people rely upon someone knowing what to do, and it's when you're in that situation that you sort of wish you'd have just paid attention. I've been in a controlled fire with the fire brigade a couple of months ago, where the task was to walk through a front door in a straight line to a back door. Now, I did this in 11 seconds. And yet when you obviously in safety equipment, and when they've got fire and there's a lot of smoke in there, it took me 3 minutes to do the exact same thing. And that's without any lighting. That was without any signs. That was without any, you've got disorientation. You've got all of this. So again, the third part of this is cutbacks in regulation and legislation. But then again, none of the fire alarms were working. That's still on the statute books. There must be, adequate. And there's another problem in legislation with health and safety. You don't have excellence, you have the word adequate.
Adequate, yes.
So, and there's a belief that, we've got this legislation, but, it's never adhered to. The number of reps, safety representatives that I teach per year, and I imagine my fellow colleagues will express this frustration. The number of safety reps who highlight frequently serious failings within companies, within housing, within different aspects of society, and are ignored, and then there aren't any mechanisms for, for any enforcement by safety reps. It's just met with a shrug shoulders and, oh well, so far as reasonably practicable is the term that's used with things like this, and that's just basically slang for if we don't think we can afford it, we won't bother.
Yes.
Fine, you're going to have in the next few months a lot of requirements for, well, we need to have more regulations, legislation, we need to have this, and this. But don't think that the law is anything other than the minimum standard. That is often and far too frequently ignored. This week, again, I mentioned I was talking about fire regulations, things like fire hydrants, what should happen in terms of testing, alarm testing, evacuation procedures, what should happen in terms of contingencies, where, if you're suddenly having to work in it or be relocated into another place of work, and this includes housing. Are you given adequate training of the risks within this new home, within this? And the answer is no. And the answer is, you've then got occupational diseases. Where this week, I was told, oh yes, well, I was off ill, but I was told to come into work, on the threat of being sacked. So it's illegal. That is not something that should happen, but does, because employers as well as landlords know that most people do not know what their rights are. Now, just to cap off this section, we shouldn't just be arguing for the law, because that's the bare minimum. We should be arguing more than this. And maybe the first step would be to give. I don't see why it is that money should influence whether or not people, worry about dying in their sleep or living in a safe and secure home. That is not the society that I was brought up in. It was not the society that the workers from the Second World War set up. This is the cumulative privatisation, and just like the banking crash, which was caused by deregulation, what we now have is the equivalent, which is effective. And whether or not this is a libel statement or not, the government is a government of murderers, because just like the banking crash, deregulation and whole profit mongering has caused the deaths of in excess of 100 people.
Yeah, put it as plain as that, because that's what it's all about. You can talk about what happened and how it happened, and talk about the specifics of that. But it's really the real big story behind it is, in fact, the culture that led to it. I mean, the Grenfell Action blog is spending weeks after weeks of putting posts up about one of the most interesting things that you would look at through it, if you do read it, is about the continuous power surges there were, which shows that they were not willing to really fix that in a fundamental way. So these power surges could have been responsible for setting off a fire in an electrical appliance like a fridge. The residents said on the blog that their TVs and computers have been destroyed, and constant power surges. So it's an unwillingness to really want to spend significant sums of money that just to meet a minimum standard. You would expect your electrical points to be safe, and for it to be tested, things with problems that you get with gas boilers and such. And when you tender out what used to be council-based services to privatised services like the KTMO, that there's and it chips into their profit, they'll just do the bare minimum. And so you have this blog, and on the blog itself, I'm sure it's circulating a lot right now. It actually says, this will not change unless something so significant as a fire happens, and they are playing with fire. They use that title in the blog, playing with fire.
I just want to come in and mention the action group, because there are action groups and communities. I mean, The attempt to destroy socialism just doesn't work because the responses from communities is commendable. That people have found their humanity, or at least humanity has been displayed in such huge quantities that the profit motive doesn't bleed through to the working classes, at least. When it comes to tragedies like this. But I just wanted to make an observation on the action group. The action group were blogging around how unsafe the buildings were, how they needed things like sprinkler systems, how they were critical of the way that the place was managed. And I have a copy of legal notices from solicitors' firms demanding that they remove those blogs. I think they had until July the 2013 or a date similar to that to remove these blogs or face legal action. So that's the response from essentially public stock, profit motive, and all of this is, as soon as any issues are raised, is met by, one bit of legislation, that doesn't appear to ever be attacked is the ability of people who have money to serve notices on people who don't. Essentially, it's not a conspiracy per se, but what it is
a power imbalance
again to silence people who are being critical. And you see community groups, but again, let's just highlight, and I can send you over the letter, and publicify that it is an absolute outrage. But we hear this all the time in the trade union movement. We hear from community members who, explain that, their oven's broken, and they then wait weeks. You've got human indignity in terms of just feeding yourself or having a cooked meal. You have other issues in terms of living on the breadline, so that, things like, a fire blanket, which, every house should have. Am I going to buy a fire blanket or am I going to feed myself? So you have an economic argument as well. But we hear every day from our safety reps, from our community members who consistently say, we are raising safety issues left, right and centre. And you know what? In the world of work, there is no right of reply from an employer. So often safety considerations go on deaf ears, or if they are considered, are often rejected on the grounds of we can't afford it. And yet the following year, their directors, board of directors, CEOs, chief operating officers, have just added an extra couple of million onto their salary.
So what we could see is a change in all of this. I mean, unfortunately, it takes such a horrendous loss of life, but the focus is now going to be on putting these regulations. But you do say that that's just the law. It may fall back into complacency again, or in terms of we may even bring back some of the laws about enforcing safety, but who's going to enforce them? But the culture surely has to have a positive change as a result of this, because people are going to be remembering this for probably the decades following, and just thinking about when any similar setup with social housing and you have a privatised landlord that is responsible, people are going to immediately reference what has happened at Grenfell if standards are poor, surely, and surely that's the good that will come out of it. I can hope. Can you not? Are we at least destined to go in this direction?
I would live in some form of hope with this. That ideally, what I would like to happen is two things that in my dreams would be that, we do not leave the European Union and that this government suddenly ends. Don't forget there's a lot of, sort of the social chapter of EU legislation are the things that protect people in houses. There are requirements in terms of welfare for things like, rights to access fresh water, just as an example, that are underpinned by EU legislation. When you look at housing standards, yes, the reaction seems to be as soon as there's a tragedy, you can look back to the Titanic for this. We saw at Rama Plaza in Bangladesh, the sweatshop, where these, sweatshop building standards are collapsed. Again, huge loss of life. Yes, there is then from the Bangladeshi courts at least enforced minimum standard for building legislation. But I'm going to say, well, I live in hope. Yeah, of course there'll be some changes around this. An inquiry by the government isn't good enough. There needs to be an inquest. And we really do need to look at ourselves in Britain, where we, prior to the Brexit vote, the country was on a precipice, and I think still is, in terms of blaming the poor, benefit cheats, and blaming immigrants and all of this. And then we have a series of attacks, from Joe Cox last year, all the way through to Grenfell, just this week, where, it takes horrendous acts, of violence, horrendous situations, fires and all of this, for things to change. But, we're focusing on one event. Every year there are fires in houses as a result of substandard safety precautions from landlords. On the day of Grenfell, there was another flat fire that hasn't had any media coverage in. I think it was in Chelsea. These things happen on a daily basis. And those people who are affected by this, will have raised issues with their landlords, will have raised their concerns to fall on deaf ears. Now, what changes can come from this? It's not just a case of safety legislation, and this is my 3 points. Gentrification, where you will find, centres, hubs of cities, where, they live safely, whereas others who, just because of their economic background, don't. We have to challenge that. How many people can afford houses? How many people can afford, as I say, fire extinguishers? Just the basics. You then have the issue with, knee-jerk reactions from horrendous situations. And you have legislation. It's a huge ask to change all of this. And we're not going to see any meaningful. We have, this is a political issue, and some people, have been critical of political point scoring. Well, do you know what? This is political. And it's not a point scoring. It's a case of, people died. People die on a daily basis because of actions taken by a government hell-bent on giving corporations cuts, giving landlords, direct payments for things like, housing benefits, for example. People who live in squalor because their landlord will not improve standards. We have this on a daily basis, and it's not been mentioned or even discussed by many in the media, and it's not often discussed even in election campaigns. We're not going to see change while we have this government in power. You are not going to see the landlords and the cabinet voting for more legislation, for more protections. their strategy, I think, is to have an inquiry and, like most inquiries, whitewash it. And in 3 years' time, when feelings aren't quite as raw, there'll be some tokenistic changes. This requires a huge movement from the ground. It requires get involved with your trade unions. Get involved with the political groups, whether it's the Labour Party or others. Get involved with the hazards campaigns and start listening to when we say we as trade unionists do not put out statements warning of death or warning of increased chances of injury or of risk for no reason. It's not political point scoring. It's not. We're just always critical of everything. These are serious concerns, that have been considered. So when we see cuts to, when we see cuts to Riddle, when we see things like, personal injury claims, that now it's no longer a case that you take your company to court for an accident that you have at work. You have to prove things like foreseeability. And do you know what? Most of this, if I were to speak to, I don't know, my brother, or someone who, is in the early 20s about health and safety legislation, most people eyes glaze over. This cannot be the way that we build change, the change that you've just spoke about. We have to start looking into it. And as dull as boring as, some might consider, fire standards and all of this, it's a case of, pay attention when you're on a plane. Because or pay attention, when you're in a new building, and ask, if you're visiting somewhere, what do I do fire? Because you don't know, you don't know whether, when you're going to be in that emergency situation.
Because there could have been people staying. And
again,
Sorry to go ahead. I'll just interject this actually, because I wanted to, which is that when people are saying, well, it can't be politicised, and or trying to really shout down criticism of the government and the administration by saying, it's a tragedy, but it's not, you can't politicise it. And of course, it's those decisions that have been reached. It's the wider context is very political, but especially this. The 72 Conservative MPs who voted down the housing bill, which would have just required private landlords and I presume also in these social housing rented situations, the likes of the KTMO to make homes fit for human habitation. That responsibility shouldn't even be, according to them, that of the landlord. And then so not even fit for human habitation. So that's very political indeed. You can't get away from that.
No, of course you can't. And like everyone else, you assume that housing, flats especially, that the fire brigade has up-to-date equipment and adequate staffing levels, so that they can, deploy things like hoses and other bits of equipment up above, ranges, above 10 stories. I mean, the gross idea of this is when you look at the picture, of the tower block, you can physically see how high, some of the hoses could reach. Just to, really paint a black and white picture, it's not good. But you assume that flats will have, sprinkler systems that at least the fire alarms detect regularly. And that they work and that they can be heard by all. You expect things like this. You expect that people who are renting property or are in council housing, that they will have fire blankets, that they will have fire hoses. They will have things that, for a blaze like that, a fire extinguisher isn't going to do anything other than maybe aid your escape. You expect things like this to be provided. And when we find out that it's not, and we find out that it's not due to cuts and inabilities to service and to inspect, and, you begin to look at that in that context, we need more than legislation. We need a huge shift. Some of the best pieces of legislation this country has seen in terms of health and safety came from mixed parties, Tories and Labour, in the period of pluralism from 45 to 79. The Health and Safety at Work Act 74 is on the books still. SRC regulations, which give reps the right to inspect and be consulted, etc., from 77. You have some of the management regulations, yes, from the 90s, but again reinforcing the Health and Safety at Work Act, for example. What we need is another great act in terms of health and safety, which I would say is not the Health and Safety at Work Act. What we need is a Health and Safety at Home Act. And we need to have duties that are placed upon employers, placed upon landlords. We need to have enforcement both in the workplace and at home. Because, situations like this cannot be allowed to continue. This cannot be the norm and the worry of people living in substandard housing. It's a political choice, and I'm afraid, that choice has been made on our behalf. And it is, especially now, Theresa May has just shown exactly how the Tories feel about people. They'd sooner get in bed with a group of paramilitary extremists rather than sit and talk to people who have lost loved ones and have lost friends.
The DUP, and of course those negotiations, we don't even know how they're going or if they're going well, but we do know that it's kind of been put on hold a little bit by this whole huge incident and the response to it. So what would you like to see changed?
Well, that's an excuse.
Well, yes, it's an excuse. These negotiations are still going to go on, but it has at least pushed it back a little bit, and the whole thing has because of the enormity of this. And there are going to be residents now in other tower blocks, some of which have this type of cladding on. There's one in Camden, for example. I don't think the surrounding blocks in Kensington. I looked on Google Street View. There were 3 others in the immediate area have it on yet, but there are quite a few. There's one in Newham, Camden, and other parts of the country that have it. But what should actually happen now? There's two parts to this question. One is with the tower blocks that have this cladding. I presume there are now going to be calls for it to come down immediately. And what should, according to your view as someone who actually works in health and safety, should be the way that a tower block is run with regard to fire safety? Just some thoughts on that in comparison to how it was at Grenfell and so on.
Again, I would split it into 3. So the political, economic, and social. Now, the political side of things, irrespective of party politics, if you just look at legislation, my view is, like I say, a general piece of legislation like the 74 Health and Safety at Work Act, Health and Safety at Home Act, which requires everyone to have things like, there should be inspections to check that you have things like a fire alarm. Don't forget, when a house goes up on fire, it's not just the people within that house. You then have neighbours' considerations and further effects also. So I think a general piece of legislation. There needs to be there needs to be absolute duties placed upon landlords, and again, just within current duties within workplaces, that management should have effective management, health and safety management systems in place. Landlords should have the same. Now, I'm not painting every landlord as some Dickensian character. But on the most part, there needs to be a gear change in the way that we approach. There needs to be Personally, I would like to see, just as you have a health and safety executive, I would like to see another executive establish an inspectorate of houses. We are, come back, politically, we are in a Dickensian period. It's not just, the tale of two cities here. What we're talking about is effectively the slum clearances, that occurred in the 20s and then after the Second World War, where there's housing stock out there, especially some of the older buildings that it might be physically impossible to improve the safety systems within them. So, Theresa May's put $5 million aside. It's not enough. There needs to be. We're talking at least, I think, when I was looking at this as a consideration, maybe as high as $20 billion in terms of building houses, building flats that are not only fit for human habitation. There's another thing that needs to be reintroduced. But essentially, countrywide slum clearances, however you define poverty, and the goalposts change with, every country. A lot of people will understand that, that things like, not having, some windows that have been taped up, on the 8th story. So I'm just thinking of an example, someone that I know who's living in Salford who's, the window shattered, and still waiting 5 weeks on for it to be replaced, because of things like logistical difficulties is the reason that's been given. Who again a couple of years ago had a lick of paint to the flat, but it is just that. It's not there's no additional standards that have been put in. So it might be the case that some housing needs to come down and in its place rebuilt. And that's a political decision. The economic side of it is that of twofold. There needs to be rent controls immediately, because, as I say, to counter gentrification, which leads to vast differences in safety, there needs to be rent controls, and there needs to be at least some form of fund that can be accessed by tenants, an automatic fund. So if you put a deposit in, let's just say for a house or a flat that you're going to rent, some of that should be accessible for buying safety equipment, like I said, from fire blankets to hydrants, things like that, the basics of safety. And I'm not just talking fire hydrants, I'm talking about the other part of safety. Some welfare considerations, such as, if you're renting a house, and you are on the breadline or below, and you have children, things like safety guards around radiators and stairs. But again, if you're making a choice between buying something like that and feeding yourself, or paying for the electric bill or whatever it might be, become unaffordable. So the economic argument is, the vast sums of money that are lost due to fires, due to, I'm just thinking of another example actually, private landlords who is one of my brother's friends who's fortunately just moved, very young children, where there's holes in stairs, there's ceilings leaking, so you've got damp, and then you've got the diseases that can come from things like that. If we're looking at an economic picture, the costs for repair and renovation and all that are minimal compared to when you end up with loss of life. So essentially what I would suggest is a complete reverse on cuts and austerity. But the social side of it, again, something else that we need to consider. You might wish, in some areas to establish things like, if you've got neighbourhood watch systems, which again replace, and enforce due to a lack of adequate policing, maybe. But maybe, social groups should be formed to set up and inspect, to essentially gather evidence for where there are unsafe practices being undertaken. So you have a myriad of different social groups. We've mentioned the Grenfell Action Group, but there are other action groups, across the northwest. I'm aware of quite a few. They really need to be speaking to each other, because the social change, in terms of just making sure, things like, anyone who's listening to this, do you have a plan if there's a fire? Have you checked your fire alarm? Do you know what you would do in the event of a fire? Who you would call, who you would get in touch with?
This is it, and then you can have
the social aspect of it.
It's a tenants union.
There are some things that we can all.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, thank you for just stealing the thunder on this, which is, there is a trade union response to this, which is, you might wish to set up, we have in Unite a community sector, which is for those who are employed, can't work, in full-time education. You might wish to set up, so I would like to see, as you say, tenant unions, where things like, why should landlords automatically receive things like housing benefit or your rent if they haven't put improvements in place? So perversely, we're here in the United States that these kind of panels were outlawed, but in the United States, a lot of tower blocks, a lot of flats, and I'm thinking in New York and Seattle, do have, in all but name, tenant associations, to cover the myriad of different landlords and all of this, where they apply pressure to improve standards, albeit on a very individualistic basis. So it could be a social change that can come from the establishment, work with the existing trade unions to apply pressure to set up tenant unions. You shouldn't have recourse. You shouldn't be evicted for not paying rent if if there hasn't been an improvement to a problem. There should be duties and protections placed for all. So again, it's a threefold. It's a threefold approach, but be under no illusion the reason for this is simply due to austerity. And we shouldn't really call it austerity. Austerity is a feeling. It's due to cuts. We've seen in the attacks in the past 3 months, the services are absolutely at the edge of how much more they can take. Hospitals, perversely, I don't know if you saw this on Wednesday, same day as the fire, Central London Hospital is to be sold off. Things like that are not, well, it's not just that they're not helpful, but again, it's just given the profit motive. What I don't want to see is, the solution from any inquiry to be an insurance-based system, which is what they're trying to do with the health service. We should have insurances for things like this. People can't afford insurances. So, yes, whilst Corbyn wants to take us back to the 70s, as some media critics are talking about, well, in the 70s we had an explosion of safety legislation, some of which might be out of date today, but at the time, cutting edge. We saw new houses, we saw, dignity, people could move into houses after the war with gardens, with basic safety standards. So, yes, fine. If you want that argument of Corbyn going back to the 70s, I'm all for it.
Then it's pretty good in the 70s in many ways, yeah.
Wants to take us to the 1870s.
Yeah, so what about, so the fire service did get there pretty quickly, but they said they were affected by cuts. So as a specific example, how could the reduced fire service have possibly affected this, do you think?
Well, if there hadn't been cuts, so there's two things. So speaking with some comrades in the Fire Brigade Union, Matt Rack is the General Secretary, has been saying for, since he took over as General Secretary, that fire crews shouldn't really be called crews anymore because, it's often driver and maybe one or two other people within there. So it's all very well getting there quickly, but when you then have a problem, which is, you're driving a truck that's, it could be 10 years old, but the equipment on it is designed pretty much for, an era when there weren't huge sprawling flats that are getting ever taller and taller. So, for the fire brigade, for example, you turn up and then realise that the equipment that, is the only equipment that you have access to isn't good enough. Imagine the psychological effect of that. Your job is to, put out fires to save people's lives. And there you are on a skeleton crew using equipment that isn't going to solve, to stop this one.
Especially the hoses that can't reach the top floor.
Yeah, exactly. So new equipment, there's plenty of equipment. If you look to the continent where, fire services have up-to-date equipment, Germany and France, have up-to-date equipment. This wouldn't have happened, I don't think, or I'd like to think it wouldn't, across the continent, where there are very specific regulations. There's funding for the services. The notion of cuts to the services in the continent would be absolutely abhorrent, and yet since we've just sat back and we blame immigrants and do all the rest of it. So if we'd have had a fully equipped, fully crewed fire service that, yes, they turn up very quickly, could have, I can't say, and I don't want to say that, could have prevented all losses of life, but certainly have been able to help in this situation. But it's not just the fire brigade. Sprinkler systems, yes, they might be costly, but if there were sprinkler systems in place, again, it wouldn't have stopped the fire externally, but certainly would have just given a little bit more time for people to leave. The fire alarms didn't go off. If the fire alarms had gone off, maybe the fire brigade could have been there earlier than that. We heard that the fire started on the second floor. Well, if the fire alarms had gone off, most fire alarms that go off, certainly in places that I've worked and lived, if they go off continuously, it automatically triggers a call to the fire brigade. So, it's not just, if only the fire brigade had been better funded, not just an argument. It's the whole picture of this. Sprinkler systems as a bare minimum, fire alarms that go off. And again, we talk about the 1970s, but the advice, we talk about training, and, as I say, I train safety reps, amongst others, on what their rights are, and hope that, they can enforce things within their workplaces. But adequate training, I wonder, well, let me ask you, when you moved into to your house, whether it's private, public, or whatever it is, were you given a list of fire instructions as to what to do in the event of a fire?
I can give you a very, very short answer to that one, and I'm sure you know what it is.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one syllable, isn't it? So no, that wasn't mentioned at all. I've been sitting here thinking about, should I buy a fire extinguisher off eBay, actually, because why not have one? Why not have a fire extinguisher in every residential place? Because even if you're not in a block,
But again, which type of fire extinguisher? But I'll talk about this in just a second in terms of things like extinguishers. But the other aspect of this is the advice that was given. And it was advice. It wasn't training. It wasn't anything instructive. It wasn't little things like a letter with a QR code to a YouTube video, or just something something basic, some basic training. People were advised to stay within their own houses or within their own flat. I mean, that's safety methodology from the 70s. We know you run and get out and stay out. And that's so when the fire brigade is saying, this is what we advise, clearly the message hadn't got to the, hadn't got to the people within the tower, but then again, most of them have been asleep. And I'm glad that, that some of the survivors from this accident have been able to say, look, we went against advice, and thank God for that. Just a note on fire extinguishers. If you are going to get fire extinguishers and all of this, you should petition your landlord if you're in rented accommodation, whomever your landlord is, for fire extinguishers. But just a very practical guide on this. Butchers are only good in what's called Category A fires, that is to say wood, textiles, fabrics. So if you look at, if you were to, my advice would be for one, I have to plug Unite the Union here, but if you were to go into Unite the Union, do a Google search and then just type in fire risk assessment, go and risk assess your house. Just go and have a look, get a list of where fires could potentially start. So, that's not to say, I'll have to turn my fridge and my freezers off or anything like that, but just have a look and see, right, well, where could a fire start? And I say extinguishers, can put out small fires, or at least stage your escape. Most houses should have a water hydrant, water extinguisher, sorry. Again, wood, textiles. But then you might wish to look at, a CO2 if there's plenty of electricals. Electrical fires, which are so-called category E fires, but again, they're on category A, so this is a debate for another day. But CO2 extinguishers assist with electrical fires. You then have things like fire blankets, which can be helpful for some oil fires or some basic cooking. But if not, you might wish to look at dry powder as another extinguisher. So most workplaces should have a range of different extinguishers. But if you are considering getting an extinguisher for your house, just have a look and see whether or not where are the most risks. Now, in most houses, your risks are cooking appliances and electrical items such as toasters and all. You might wish to consider things like that before just going and getting any extinguisher. And the second thing is make sure that you or anyone else that lives with you knows how to use them.
Good point.
You should ask your landlord, again, if you're in private public or rented accommodation. You should ask them for a fire risk assessment. You have a right to request this, and you have a right to receive this. And not just that, do the same in work as well. I can't stress how important this is. Employers, fail on so many grounds of health and safety. There are some good employers out there, that I could name, but they're outweighed by so many that I can't name. So speak to your safety rep if you have one. If you don't, why not become one? and start educating yourself on, just the basics of at least health and safety. Speak to your local courses on basic safety, fire safety, basic safety at home. Speak to your unions who have training programs for things like this. Speak to your community, and see whether or not you can get, someone from the fire brigade, if they can, or again, someone from the union movement to come and do a half an hour talk, engage with community groups and the community sections, of places like Unite, to get talks, to come and do just essentials. Things like this really can make huge difference and crucial change. Change always comes from the bottom. It is never top down. So we need to be applying pressure. We've had our eye off the ball with this. There have been warnings over the past 5 years, 10 years of cuts to safety legislation and the effect that it will have. And the shameful and saddening part of this is the fact that our predictions from our movement have unfortunately been done.
Those are the thoughts generally on the situation, the whole context of Grenfell Tower. That really it is a story that led to the fire, which is actually the most important. So the final thoughts could be, well, sprinklers should have been on every flat. There should have been communal fire alarms. These power surges, and of course we're in the realms of theory there. If there were power surges affecting the block, they could have disrupted that sort of safety equipment as well, which is something they raised. So as nobody heard that them working, who knows if that was the reason why they were not working, because they've been affected by power surges, been blown out. So that's...
Again, it comes down to maintenance, and it comes down to placed upon landlords. If you talk about signage and things like how to aid people in an evacuation, I'll just pick a workplace, but this can apply to to people living in flats or houses. If a substantial chunk of your workforce or of your flat, English is not your first language, then we're talking about saving lives here. There should be things like duolingual assist people. I don't want people translating, while they're in an evacuation for what to do. So there's little practical steps like that that can be taken. You talk about power surges. Well, the thing is with any accident, or incident, it's not. We quite like in society to have someone's to blame or some things to blame. But it's not quite caught with because every accident is caused by a series of smaller sort of categories, if you will.
Contributory factors.
So we undertake things called fault tree analysis, where essentially what you do is, so it could be part of multiple causes. So if there was a power surge, well, is it maintenance? So was it adequate but not maintained? Was there PAT testing in place? PAT testing is portable appliance testing, which isn't a legal requirement. You might be surprised to hear it. It's an ISO standard. So maybe another positive step from that should be PAT testing becomes legal requirement. So if it was PAT tested, so if are there, so it's not just the appliance testing, other things such as was lighting adequate? So in terms of in flats, was there adequate lighting to see whether or not any plugs had been, were faulty? Was lighting adequate during during an evacuation? Why wasn't an evacuation alarm sounded? So you see, this incident is not just, and there were plenty of other considerations as well. There are causes to every accident that build up to the accident or the incident. Yes, if there's a power surge, well, okay, there's one of the effects of this incident, but there were a whole host of other things. There wasn't adequate lighting within stairwells. The reports of people tripping over in smoke, so there wasn't emergency exit signs that were lighted. Was there emergency lighting? Which I find, I'd be very surprised if there were. Were there, in terms of smoke, things like adequate LEV systems, local exhaust ventilation systems, on every floor. So this is when we talk about the catalogue of errors, this really is a catalogue of errors, most of which, I believe, at least, could have been avoided. Let's just again bear in mind, we focus on one incident. When the Titanic's sunk, it was one incident that changed things. But let's not forget how many other ships sank with other horrendous losses of life as well. Just as there are other fires that affect people in the same way on a day-to-day basis, which is unfortunate that again could have been avoided, and could have been avoided for the reasons that I've outlined: cuts, gentrification, and political choices.
Okay, so that's the whole thing that we've looked at now, about the context of Grenfell Tower. So I'm going to thank you very much, Jay, for coming on Channel 107, the 107 stream. We've also decided to go live with it as well, even though it was short notice, but we can also put out a repeat as well, of course, and be able to listen to this as well, and hopefully gather some other people as well who want to talk about perhaps somebody from London who wants to talk about what has led up to it, and what some of those concerns were, and what it's like to live in social housing. I'm also going to be speaking to someone in Liverpool at some point about what the issues are at living in a tower block and not getting your concerns and maintenance. It falls on deaf ears,